tonight is talk to you a little bit about how gardening can act as subversion, and how we might be able to take a Marxist or more generally a communist thought process and put it together with an environmental ethic and produce a new concept of community that will allow us to rethink how we might coexist in a post-capitalist society. So I'm going to kind of work through this a little more systematically than I did 2 weeks ago, only because these arguments are a little more finessed than a couple of weeks ago when we were just kind of laying the groundwork for these subsequent talks. So this is going to look a little more formal than maybe you were expecting, but it'll work. It'll be all right. Okay. So the premise of this paper then starts with, what does it mean to move a community forward in the late stage capitalism, right? When you're dealing with decaying capitalism, failing infrastructure, industrial abandonment, things of that nature. And when you're looking at communities that are in failing states, various stages of collapse, how can community gardens or community environmental activities bring people together and reorient them to the world? That's the operating assumption, is that somehow we can figure that out, okay? So even in a world conceived as having been created for the service of humankind, there is a recognizable necessity to the place of humans in nature, whereby nature's service is indicative of human dependence. And human dependence is indicative of a larger interdependence. This is largely uncontroversial. I'll just take that to be the case, right? Existence is a harmony and balance between give and take that can too easily be disrupted is sort of what's at stake here, right? That we've caused an asymmetry in our relationship to nature that's not recoverable, right? So we have done real harm in figuring out how to move beyond that is sort of the problem now. And so this first part of the paper, if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, you'll recognize some of the echoes of that first talk, because it was meant to set this one up, and this one is meant to set the next one up about deep and dark ecology. So hopefully you'll kind of see both past and future connections as we move forward. Turkish Sufi master Abdülhamit Sakmat argues that the world exists to serve people because man is the most honorable of all creatures. There are cycles in life, and from the seed comes the tree, from the tree comes the fruit, and we humans give back after we eat the fruit. Everything is meant to serve man. If people are gone from this cycle, nature itself will be over. Okay? And I don't know how familiar you are with Sufi Islam, right? But they have a very different worldview than the average Muslim, even though I think Islam has a much better concept of how humans are supposed to relate to nature than their Christian counterparts. If for no other reason, then there are very serious restrictions on Islamic behavior that are set down by Allah that are not as contradictory as or in conflict with other parts of the Quran, right? Whereas in the Bible there are clear contradictions between what God wants, right? Or at least what God purports to want from his creation. To the extent that the Sufi insight is onto something integral about the relationship between humans and nature, it may be worth stating the obvious with respect to this type of conception. First, there is a debatable religious tone to this understanding which concerns the present argument. Second, what humans give back is an ambiguous idea, but any fleshing out of that concept is going to be clear that the relationship people have with nature today would not likely capture what the Sufi master is trying to articulate. And finally, it would seem to be the case that humans have cultivated the capacity to bring about the end of nature before we have finished vanquishing ourselves, right? So that's his position, right? That if people are gone from the cycle, then nature will be over. And there's good reason to believe that we have outpaced ourselves in our ability to destroy nature before we are gone, right? So that's part of my concern as well. So contemporary society is facing a host of environmental challenges with varying degrees of severity and it seems likely that the challenge facing an increasingly eco-conscious society lies in determining how to better understand the world along those fault lines of understanding that develop out of Master Sakhmat's conception of the world. That said, let's use a neo-Marxist Epicurean philosophical approach to the problems inherent in this conception of human and nature relationships. Okay. To do that, then, I want to approach this in a two-part way. So I want to make arguments that are going to be filtered through a lens of communal gardening with an eye toward how both Marx and Epicurus can help us figure this out. And I use these two on purpose, one because they're both incredibly awesome, but also what you may not know is that Marx did his dissertation on Epicurus. Though his dissertation was written on Epicurean metaphysics, Marx is heavily influenced by Epicurean philosophy early in his life, and it comes through in a lot of his philosophy, especially when he's talking about how communism should look. Though it is also true, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, it's also true that Marx drops the ball on the environmental aspects of his own worldview, right? Which is a clear failing, and I think Epicurus is right to be upset with him. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the world looks in late-stage capitalism falling apart around us, right? So I want to give you some very specific examples of what I'm thinking of when I talk about kind of the collapse of the natural world that we're going to have to contend with. So capitalists have long defined the relationship between humans and nature vis-a-vis the religious influences stemming from interpretations of creation in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Though the biblical provisions regarding creation offer three defensible, divinely sanctioned relationships, it is usually the despotic relationship that is most favored by capitalism. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, so if this sounds foreign to you, it's because you skipped the talk. But in the Q&A, we can go back to this if you want. Right? The despotic tradition dictates that all of creation was provided for humankind's sustenance, and all of nature is not only at our disposal, but it is our duty to bring it to heel. This interpretation finds a lot of support amongst industry and enterprise that requires the destruction of the environment for capitalist gain. Here you should hear me say profit when I say that. For instance, Corky DeMarco, right? And anybody named Corky is probably going to be environmentally destructive. Corky DeMarco, executive director of the West Virginia Oil and Natural Gas Association, had the following to say in 2016. God didn't want us to be farmers, or this place would look like Kansas. God put us here in these mountains that are 450 million years old with the best coal in the world and the most natural gas. And we have a responsibility, and I think companies like Dominion and others have seized on those opportunities that these mountains provided, and we will continue to do this. Right? So that, this is representative of these ideas. This is not an anomaly, right? This is a guy legitimately arguing that God sanctions coal mining, right? Which is kind of a weird way to think about the world. DeMarco is not alone in his assumption of God's support, as other industry officials use the act of God defense for everything from mountaintop removal to cancer to on-the-job deaths. For example, Don Blankenship, CEO of Massey Energy, which is another coal mining company, used the defense after the Big Branch mine disaster killed 29 miners in 2010. And, not to pick solely on coal, the timber industry has also used the defense as well, as they did in Oso, Washington in 2014, when a massive 300-acre mudslide resulting from extensive clear-cutting destroyed an entire community, a watershed, and killed 30 people in the process. The defense that the timber industry offered was that the mudslide was an act of God and had nothing to do with the clear cutting, that they were separate events, right? So they clear cut a mountainside, which resulted in a mudslide, but the mudslide was actually God having a fit of pique, right? He was angry about something, and it wasn't the timber industry. What do I know, right? I'm just a reporter here.